The wail of an infant pierced the dawn quiet of Redemption Creek, Montana, in the spring of 1876, a sound that would forever alter the course of Preston McKinney's solitary life. The tall cowboy had been on his way to the livery when the unmistakable cry drew him to the whitewashed church at the edge of town, where a small bundle lay abandoned on the wooden steps, squirming and red-faced in the morning light. Preston removed his worn Stetson and knelt beside the infant, no more than a few weeks old, wrapped hastily in a tattered quilt. His weathered face softened as he lifted the child, cradling him awkwardly in arms more accustomed to roping cattle than holding something so delicate. "Now where'd you come from, little fella?" he murmured, glancing around at the empty street. The baby's cries quieted somewhat as Preston rocked him gently, revealing bright blue eyes that seemed to study the stranger holding him. "Don't you worry none, I got you." Preston had never given much thought to fatherhood. At 32, he'd spent his life drifting from ranch to ranch, taking work where he could find it, saving his earnings and keeping to himself. He'd finally managed to purchase a modest spread just outside of town 6 months ago, determined to put down roots at last. But he certainly hadn't planned on doing it with a child. The door of the church creaked open, and Reverend Thomas emerged, still buttoning his collar. "Mr. McKinney." I heard crying. The Reverend stopped short at the sight of Preston holding the infant. "Good heavens, where did this child come from? Found him just now," Preston replied, adjusting the blanket around the baby's tiny form. "Someone left him here on your doorstep." The Reverend peered at the bundle. "Is there a note? Anything to identify the poor thing?" Preston shook his head. "Nothing I can see." "We should notify Sheriff Collins right away. Perhaps someone in town knows of a woman who was with child." The Reverend reached for the baby, but Preston found himself reluctant to hand him over. "I'll take care of that," Preston said, surprising himself. "And I'll take care of him too until we sort this out." "You, Mr. McKinney?" The Reverend's eyebrows rose. "Forgive me, but you're a bachelor with a new ranch. Caring for an infant requires considerable attention and knowledge." Preston looked down at the child, who had quieted in his arms and was now blinking drowsily. Something in his chest tightened, a feeling he couldn't name. "I can manage," he said firmly. "My sister had 4 little ones. I've been around babies before." "At least allow me to help you find a wet nurse," the Reverend insisted. "The child will need feeding right away." "Appreciate that," Preston nodded, "and I'll need some supplies, I reckon." As they discussed the immediate needs, the baby made a small sound and gripped Preston's finger with surprising strength. The cowboy felt something shift inside him, a certainty he couldn't explain. "What will you call him?" the Reverend asked. "For the time being, at least." Preston studied the infant's face, taking in the tuft of dark hair and those alert blue eyes. Without hesitation, he answered, "Samuel. I'll call him Samuel." He paused, then added quietly, "My son." By midday, word had spread throughout Redemption Creek that Preston McKinney had found an abandoned baby, and most surprisingly, had taken the child into his care. The general store was abuzz with speculation when Hannah Edwards pushed open the door, her arms laden with medical supplies for Doc Wilson's office, where she worked as his assistant. Hannah had arrived in town just 3 months prior, having traveled west from Boston after her father's passing left her with little means of support. At 26, she was considered by many to be firmly on the shelf, but her medical knowledge gained through years of assisting her physician father had quickly made her indispensable to the aging doctor of Redemption Creek. "Miss Edwards, Mrs. Patterson," the shopkeeper's wife, called out as Hannah entered. "Have you heard about the baby?" Hannah set her packages on the counter. "What baby would that be, Mrs. Patterson?" "A newborn, left on the church steps this very morning." "And that McKinney fellow, you know, the quiet one who bought the old Dawson place, he's taken it upon himself to care for the child." "Can you imagine? A bachelor cowboy raising an infant?" Hannah frowned. "The poor child. Has anyone determined who might have abandoned it?" "Not a soul has claimed knowledge of it," Mrs. Patterson replied, leaning forward. "Sheriff's asking around, but Preston McKinney's already calling the boy his son. Bought out half our baby items this morning with that widow Simmons advising him." Hannah's mind raced. A newborn would need proper medical attention, especially one who had been abandoned outdoors. "Where are they now?" she asked. "Mrs. Simmons took them to her place. She's got milk from her goats that might do for the baby until a proper wet nurse is found. Hannah gathered her packages. I should let Doc Wilson know. The baby will need to be examined. As she hurried toward the doctor's office, Hannah couldn't help but wonder about this Preston McKinney. She'd seen him in town occasionally, a tall, broad-shouldered man who kept to himself, nodding politely when their paths crossed, but never engaging in conversation. What would compel such a man to suddenly take responsibility for an abandoned infant? Doc Wilson was dozing in his chair when Hannah entered the office, but he roused at the sound of the door. "What's all that commotion about down at Patterson's?" he asked, adjusting his spectacles. Hannah quickly explained the situation with the abandoned baby as she unpacked the supplies. "Well now," the doctor said, stroking his white beard, "that's quite a development, and you say McKinney's taken the child in." "So it seems," Hannah replied. "I thought perhaps we should offer to examine the baby to ensure it's healthy." "Good thinking," Doc Wilson nodded, "though I suspect Mrs. Simmons has already sent for me. That woman doesn't let much get past her." "I could go," Hannah offered. "You have appointments this afternoon with Mr. Hollister's rheumatism, and Mrs. Fenton's expecting her time any day now." The doctor studied her for a moment. "Very well. Take my bag and see to it the child is properly examined, and perhaps offer some guidance to Mr. McKinney. I suspect he'll need it." Hannah collected the medical bag and set out for the widow Simmons' cottage on the edge of town. The spring air was warm, and wildflowers dotted the roadside. Hannah had grown to appreciate the rugged beauty of Montana territory, so different from the crowded streets of Boston. When she arrived at the small white house surrounded by a neat garden, she heard a baby's cry from within. She knocked briskly, and the door was opened by a plump, gray-haired woman with a harried expression. "Mrs. Simmons, I'm Hannah Edwards, Doc Wilson's assistant. I've come to check on the baby." Relief washed over the older woman's face. "Thank the Lord. Come in, come in." "That poor man is at his wit's end already, and it's not been half a day." Hannah stepped inside to find Preston McKinney pacing the small parlor, jiggling the wailing infant awkwardly in his arms. His hat was off, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His expression was one of desperate concentration. "Mr. McKinney," Hannah said, setting down her bag, "I'm Hannah Edwards from Doc Wilson's office. I've come to examine the baby." Preston looked up, and Hannah was struck by the intensity of his hazel eyes, filled with concern and something that looked remarkably like fear. "Miss Edwards," he acknowledged with a nod. "Appreciate you coming. Samuel here won't stop crying. Mrs. Simmons tried feeding him some goat's milk, but he took hardly any." Hannah approached and held out her arms. "May I?" He seemed reluctant to hand over the child, but did so carefully. Hannah cradled the infant, noting his flushed face and the way his tiny fists were clenched. "How long has he been crying like this?" she asked, gently unwrapping the blanket to better examine him. "On and off since I found him, but worse this past hour," Preston replied, watching her every move with hawk-like attention. Hannah checked the baby methodically, the way her father had taught her. "He seems to be about 2 weeks old, perhaps a bit more. No signs of illness that I can see." She rewrapped him snugly, then held him upright against her shoulder, patting his back gently. After a moment, the baby let out a small burp and his crying subsided somewhat. "He likely has colic," Hannah explained, "and he may not be taking well to the goat's milk. We'll need to find a wet nurse as soon as possible." Mrs. Simmons spoke up. "I've sent word to Mary Donnelly. She had her baby 2 months ago and might be willing to help." Preston ran a hand through his hair. "And if she's not, then we'll try a different formula," Hannah said, continuing to soothe the now quieter infant. "Diluted cow's milk with a bit of sugar might agree with him better than the goat's milk." She glanced around the parlor, noting the hasty purchases from the general store cloths, a small wooden cradle, bottles. "You've decided to care for him yourself, Mr. McKinney." His jaw set in a determined line. "Yes, madam, found him, figure he's my responsibility now." "That's very admirable," Hannah said carefully, "but caring for an infant is no small undertaking, especially for a single man running a ranch." "I'm aware," he replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone, "but I ain't one to walk away from what needs doing." Hannah studied him, noting the sincerity in his expression. "In that case, you'll need some instruction. Babies require specific care, particularly newborns." I told him he's bit off more than he can chew, Mrs. Simmons interjected, but he's stubborn as a mule. Preston's eyes remained on Hannah. I'm a quick study, Miss Edwards, and I'm willing to learn what needs learning. Something in his steady gaze made Hannah believe him. She nodded slowly. Very well. Let me show you how to properly hold him to ease his discomfort. For the next hour, Hannah demonstrated various techniques for holding, burping, and soothing the infant. Preston watched intently, his large hands surprisingly gentle when she passed Samuel back to him. The baby eventually drifted off to sleep against his broad chest. You'll need to feed him every few hours, Hannah explained softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping infant. And change his cloths just as often. Babies this young can't regulate their temperature well, so keep him warm but not overheated. Preston nodded, his attention split between her instructions and the tiny sleeping face pressed against him. I should get back to the doctor's office, Hannah said, gathering her bag. But I'll check on Samuel again tomorrow if that's agreeable. Much obliged, Miss Edwards, Preston replied. I'll be taking him home to the ranch tonight once I've got everything sorted. Hannah hesitated. Are you certain that's wise, Mrs. Simmons might be better equipped to. I appreciate the widow's help, he interrupted quietly, but Samuel's my responsibility now. My son. The way he said the word with such certainty despite having known the child for mere hours caught Hannah off guard. Very well, she conceded. But please send word if you have any concerns, day or night. A newborn can take a turn quite suddenly. As Hannah took her leave, she couldn't help but ponder the unusual situation. Preston McKinney hardly seemed the type to suddenly take on fatherhood. Yet there had been something in the way he held that baby, something in his determined expression that suggested he might just be equal to the task. What she couldn't have anticipated was how thoroughly that baby would entangle their lives in the months to come. The first week of Samuel's life at the McKinney Ranch tested Preston's resolve like nothing he'd ever experienced. The baby seemed to cry constantly, sleeping only in short bursts that rarely aligned with Preston's desperate need for rest. Mary Donnelly had agreed to nurse the infant twice daily, but the rest of the time, Preston struggled with the formula Hannah Edwards had suggested. On the seventh night, after 3 hours of walking the floor with a screaming Samuel, Preston saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness and rode to town with the baby bundled against his chest. Hannah's small room behind Doc Wilson's office had a lamp burning in the window. She often stayed up late studying medical texts, and Preston felt a rush of relief as he dismounted and approached her door. His knock was answered quickly, as if she'd been waiting for someone. Mr. McKinney. Hannah appeared in the doorway, her honey-brown hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual neat bun. She wore a robe over her nightgown, and Preston immediately felt foolish for disturbing her at such an hour. I apologize for the intrusion, Miss Edwards, he said, shifting the fussing bundle in his arms. But Samuel won't stop crying. He's not running a fever, but something's wrong, and I didn't know where else to turn. Hannah's expression softened. Come in, please. She stepped aside, allowing him into the small, tidy room that served as both her living quarters and study. Preston stood awkwardly in the center of the room, aware of the impropriety of being in a single woman's quarters at night, but too desperate to worry about proprieties. Let me see him, Hannah said, taking Samuel gently from his arms. She unwrapped the blanket and examined the baby thoroughly, her movements confident and soothing. Has he been feeding well? Any changes in his habits? He takes the milk sometimes, but mostly fusses and turns away, Preston explained, his voice rough with exhaustion. And he's been drawing his legs up to his belly like he's in pain. Hannah nodded, laying Samuel on her small bed and massaging his tiny abdomen with practiced fingers. It's likely stomach discomfort. The cow's milk may be too harsh for his system. Is there something else we can try? Preston asked, removing his hat and running a hand through his disheveled hair. Hannah looked up at him, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the slump of his shoulders. There are a few remedies we might attempt, but first you look like you might fall over, Mr. McKinney. Please sit. Preston sank gratefully into the chair she indicated, watching as Hannah mixed something in a small cup. A weak tea of chamomile, she explained. Just a few drops may help ease his discomfort. She skillfully administered the liquid to the infant, who sputtered but swallowed. Then she swaddled him tightly in a fresh blanket and began to rock him, humming softly. Preston felt his own eyelids growing heavy as he watched her gentle movements. Hannah Edwards was a revelation, competent, kind, and unruffled by the crisis that had driven him to her door in desperation. Her simple calico nightgown and loose hair gave her a softer appearance than her usual practical work attire, and Preston found himself noticing the delicate curve of her neck as she bent over the baby. "You're good with him," he commented, forcing himself to focus. Hannah smiled slightly. "I helped deliver many babies in Boston working with my father, and I had younger siblings. Your family's back east," a shadow crossed her face. "My parents have passed. My brothers have their own families now in Massachusetts." Preston nodded, understanding the unspoken reason for her presence in Montana territory. Many came west seeking a fresh start after loss or hardship. "What about you, Mr. McKinney?" Hannah asked, still rocking the now quieter Samuel. "Do you have family?" "Sister in Colorado," he replied. "Her husband's got a good ranch there. Parents died in a fire when I was 19. He didn't elaborate on the years of drifting that followed, taking whatever work he could find until he'd saved enough for his own place. Hannah studied him with those perceptive brown eyes. "And yet you've taken on the responsibility of raising a child alone." Preston shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Seemed like the right thing to do. Most men would have left him with the church or sought a family to take him in," she observed. Preston was quiet for a moment, struggling to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. "When I found him there crying all alone," he finally said, "something just clicked into place, like I was meant to be the one walking by right then." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know it sounds foolish." To his surprise, Hannah didn't look skeptical. "Not foolish," she said softly. "Perhaps providential." Samuel had finally drifted to sleep in her arms, his tiny face peaceful for the first time in hours. Preston watched, marveling at the transformation. "You've a magic touch, Miss Edwards," he said. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Not magic, just experience." She carefully transferred the sleeping infant back to Preston's arms. "Try the chamomile tea when he's fussy, and perhaps we should try goat's milk again, but more diluted than Mrs. Simmons prepared it." Preston stood, cradling Samuel carefully to avoid waking him. "I can't thank you enough for your help, especially at this hour." "It's no trouble," she assured him, moving to open the door. "That's what neighbors do in places like this, help each other." As Preston stepped outside into the cool night air, Samuel still peacefully sleeping against his chest, he turned back to Hannah. "Would it be an imposition to ask if you might come out to the ranch tomorrow to show me how to prepare the milk properly?" Hannah hesitated only briefly. "I'll come after my duties at the doctor's office are complete, around 4 o'clock if that suits." "That would be just fine," Preston said, relief evident in his voice. "I'm much obliged, Miss Edwards." As he mounted his horse for the ride home, Samuel securely bundled against him, Preston felt a curious lightness despite his exhaustion. He hadn't expected to find such understanding and help in Redemption Creek, having spent so many years relying solely on himself. Yet in just a week, a tiny abandoned baby had somehow connected him to the community in ways he never anticipated. And perhaps most surprisingly, to Hannah Edwards, whose kind brown eyes and capable hands had brought him a measure of peace in his moment of desperation. The following afternoon, Hannah approached the McKinney ranch with a basket of supplies balanced on her arm. The property sat nestled in a small valley with mountains rising in the distance, a modest but well-built cabin with a barn and corral beside it. A creek wound through the eastern edge of the property, explaining why the land was greener than much of the surrounding area. As she neared the cabin, Hannah spotted Preston in the yard, Samuel cradled in one arm while he awkwardly attempted to hang laundry tiny cloths and blankets with his free hand. The sight of the tall cowboy performing this domestic task, his expression one of intense concentration, brought a smile to her lips. "Good afternoon, Mr. McKinney," she called as she approached. Preston turned, relief washing over his features when he saw her. "Miss Edwards, right on time." He gestured to the clothesline. "Samuel's been going through these faster than I expected." "Babies tend to do that," Hannah replied, taking in the dark circles still evident under his eyes. "How did he sleep after you returned home last night?" "Better than he has all week," Preston admitted. though he was up with the sun again. Hannah set her basket down and held out her arms. "May I take him while you finish here?" Preston handed over the infant, who was awake and alert, his blue eyes studying Hannah's face. "He seems to like you," Preston observed as Samuel made a small, contented sound. "Babies respond to calm handling," Hannah explained, though she was secretly pleased by the infant's reaction to her. "And I suspect he can sense when you're anxious about his care." Preston nodded, returning to his task of hanging the laundry. "Reckon that's true enough. I've broken wild horses that scared me less than trying to figure out what this little fella needs." Hannah laughed softly. "At least horses can't wake you every 2 hours demanding to be fed." "There is that," Preston agreed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The expression transformed his usually serious face, and Hannah found herself noticing the pleasant crinkles it formed around his eyes. Once the laundry was hung, Preston led Hannah into the cabin. It was simply furnished but clean, with a kitchen area, a main room with a stone fireplace, and what appeared to be 2 small bedrooms off to one side. A roughly constructed cradle sat near the fireplace, and baby items were scattered around the main room, evidence of Samuel's sudden arrival in Preston's bachelor existence. "I've been meaning to tidy up," Preston said, hastily gathering a pile of cloths from a chair so Hannah could sit. "Please don't apologize," Hannah said, settling into the chair with Samuel. "You've had your hands quite full." Preston moved to stoke the fire, then filled a kettle with water. "Can I offer you coffee? It's about all I can manage to make properly these days." "That would be lovely," Hannah accepted, then gestured to her basket. "I've brought some supplies that might help: a rubber nipple that fits more securely on the bottle, some cloth specially sewn for swaddling, and goat's milk from Mrs. Peterson's nanny. Her goats produce milk that seems to agree better with infants than most." Preston's expression was one of genuine gratitude. "You didn't have to go to such trouble." "It's no trouble," Hannah assured him. "As I said last night, neighbors help each other here." As Preston prepared the coffee, Hannah demonstrated how to properly dilute the goat's milk and warm it to the right temperature. She then showed him how to test it on his wrist before feeding, and how to hold Samuel in a position that would reduce his discomfort. "The key is consistency," she explained as Samuel eagerly accepted the bottle. "Babies thrive on routine, even at this young age." Preston watched attentively, asking questions that revealed both his concern for doing things correctly and his complete inexperience with infant care. There was something endearing about his determination to learn, about the gentleness of his large, work-roughened hands when he took Samuel back to burp him as Hannah had shown. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters of infant care: feeding schedules, bathing, signs of illness to watch for. Hannah found herself impressed by Preston's quick grasp of her instructions and his willingness to adapt his life to accommodate Samuel's needs. "What about your ranch work?" Hannah asked as they finished their coffee. "How are you managing both?" Preston sighed. "Not as well as I'd like. I've had to let some things slide this week, but I've hired a local boy, Jimmy Fredericks, to help with the livestock starting tomorrow. And I'm building a sling to carry Samuel while I work around the property." "That's quite resourceful," Hannah said, genuinely impressed. Preston shrugged, "Just doing what needs doing." He hesitated, then added, "Though I'll admit, there are moments I wonder if I've lost my mind, thinking I can raise a child alone out here." The vulnerability in his admission touched Hannah. "Many women raise children alone," she said gently, "and they often have far fewer resources than you do." "True enough," Preston acknowledged, "but they at least know what they're about. Half the time I feel like I'm stumbling around in the dark with this little fella." Hannah considered him for a moment. "You know, I could stop by every few days to check on his progress and answer any questions you might have. As part of my medical duties," she added hastily. Relief flickered across Preston's face, quickly replaced by concern. "I wouldn't want to impose on your time, Miss Edwards." "You must be busy enough with Doc Wilson's practice." "It would be no imposition," Hannah assured him, "and to be perfectly honest, I've grown rather fond of young Samuel already." She smiled down at the baby, who had fallen asleep in Preston's arms. Something in Preston's expression softened as he looked at her. "In that case, I'd be much obliged for your help, Miss Edwards." "Hannah," she said impulsively, "if we're to work together caring for Samuel, you might as well use my given name. He nodded, a slight smile warming his features. Hannah, then, and I'm Preston to my friends. The way he said her name, with a gentle drawl that somehow made it sound special, caused an unexpected flutter in Hannah's chest. She busied herself with repacking her basket, suddenly aware of the impropriety of her offer. A single woman making regular visits to a bachelor's home would certainly set tongues wagging in Redemption Creek, regardless of the professional pretext. As if reading her thoughts, Preston spoke up. Perhaps it might be best if your visits were official-like. Maybe Doc Wilson could make it known you're checking on the baby's health on his behalf. Hannah looked up, grateful for his understanding. That would be wise. Small towns do tend to notice such things. That they do, Preston agreed ruefully. Though I reckon they're already talking plenty about the foolish cowboy trying to raise a baby on his own. Not foolish, Hannah corrected him firmly. Compassionate. What you've done for Samuel is admirable, Preston. A faint color touched his cheekbones at her praise. Just seemed like the right thing to do. He repeated his words from the night before, but this time with more certainty. As Hannah prepared to leave, Preston walked her to her horse, still carrying the sleeping Samuel. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, gilding Preston's dark hair and illuminating the peaceful face of the infant in his arms. The scene struck Hannah as oddly right, this strong, serious man cradling a tiny life with such care. I'll return in 3 days, she promised as Preston helped her mount her horse, his hand steady under her elbow, but send for me sooner if you have any concerns. I will, he agreed. And Hannah, he paused, meeting her eyes with an earnest gaze, thank you for everything. As Hannah rode back toward town, she found herself reflecting on the curious turn her life had taken. 3 months in Redemption Creek, and already she was deeply involved in the welfare of an abandoned infant and his unlikely guardian. She had come west seeking a fresh start, a place to use her medical knowledge and perhaps escape the memories of all she had lost in Boston. She hadn't expected to find herself drawn to a quiet cowboy with serious eyes and gentle hands, or to a tiny baby with no history but an uncertain future. Yet somehow, their unexpected entry into her ordered life felt strangely like the beginning of something important. Spring turned to summer, and Samuel thrived under the joint care of Preston and Hannah. The baby grew plump and strong, his initial colic subsiding as he adjusted to the goat's milk formula. His dark hair curled more with each passing week, and his blue eyes tracked movement with increasing awareness. He had begun to smile first at Preston, then at Hannah, a development that filled them both with disproportionate joy. Hannah's professional visits to check on Samuel's health had become a regular part of her routine, occurring every 3 days without fail. She told herself it was purely medical concern that prompted her consistent attention, but the truth was more complicated. Those hours at the McKinney ranch had become the highlight of her week, watching Samuel's development, certainly, but also observing the transformation in Preston. The serious, solitary cowboy had adapted to fatherhood with remarkable determination. He'd rearranged his entire routine around Samuel's needs, wearing the baby in a sling of his own design while he performed ranch chores, talking to him constantly in a gentle voice that contrasted with his rugged appearance. His cabin had gradually transformed as well, becoming more organized as he'd built shelves and storage specifically for Samuel's things. On a warm July afternoon, Hannah arrived to find Preston and Samuel on the porch, the baby lying on a blanket while Preston sat nearby whittling a small wooden horse. Samuel was kicking his legs enthusiastically and making happy gurgling sounds, reaching toward the colorful wildflowers Hannah had brought during her last visit, now displayed in a jar on the porch rail. Well, don't you look content, young man, Hannah greeted Samuel, kneeling to stroke his round cheek. The baby immediately turned toward her voice, a wide, gummy smile spreading across his face. He's been watching for you, Preston said, setting aside his carving. Gets excited when he hears a horse approaching around this time of day. Hannah felt a rush of pleasure at the thought that Samuel anticipated her visits. He's becoming more aware of routines, she observed, lifting him into her arms and receiving a happy squeal in response. Smart as a whip, this one, Preston agreed proudly. The way he spoke of Samuel now was completely natural, like a father who had always known his child, rather than a man who had found him just 3 months ago. "Has Mary Donnelly stopped by this week?" Hannah asked, referring to the young mother who still occasionally helped with nursing Samuel, supplementing his formula feedings. Preston nodded. "Yesterday, says he's growing faster than her own baby." He hesitated, then added, "She also mentioned that her husband's got work in Helena. They'll be moving at the end of the month." Hannah understood the implication immediately, so Samuel will be fully weaned to the bottle. "Reckon so," Preston said. "Think he'll manage all right. He's already taking most of his nourishment from the formula," Hannah assured him. "And he's started showing interest in watching you eat. It won't be long before he's ready for his first solid foods." Preston looked simultaneously alarmed and intrigued by this information. "What sort of foods, and when?" Hannah smiled at his eagerness to learn. Over the past months, she had come to admire his dedication to understanding every aspect of Samuel's care and development. "Usually around 6 months. We'll start with simple things: mashed vegetables, very soft porridge." 6 months, Preston repeated thoughtfully. "That would be September by my reckoning. He was likely born in March, given his size when I found him." "That seems about right," Hannah agreed, bouncing Samuel gently as he grabbed at her collar. "He's developing right on schedule, holding his head up well, responding to voices, showing good strength in his limbs." Preston watched them with a soft expression that Hannah had begun to notice more frequently when he looked at her with Samuel. It created a curious warmth in her chest that she tried not to examine too closely. "Coffee's ready inside," Preston said, standing and collecting his whittling materials. "Unless you'd prefer to stay out here in the breeze. The porch is lovely," Hannah replied. "Summer won't last forever." Preston nodded and disappeared inside, returning moments later with 2 cups of coffee. He'd become adept at preparing things one-handed while holding Samuel, but today he moved with the freedom of having both hands available as Hannah held the baby. They settled into the wooden chairs Preston had crafted, Samuel contentedly exploring the lace edge of Hannah's collar. "Sheriff Collins stopped by yesterday," Preston mentioned casually, though Hannah detected an undercurrent in his tone. "Oh, what did he want?" Preston took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Says there's been inquiries from a woman over in Silver Creek, claims she might know something about Samuel's mother." Hannah's arms tightened instinctively around the baby. "What sort of information?" "Nothing specific yet." "Sheriff's riding over there tomorrow to speak with her directly." Preston's jaw was set in a way Hannah had come to recognize as tension. "Says it might help identify Samuel's family." "I see," Hannah said carefully, noting the conflict evident in Preston's expression. "And how do you feel about that possibility?" Preston was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains beyond his property. "Reckon every child deserves to know where they came from," he finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. Hannah studied his profile, understanding what he wasn't saying. After 3 months of caring for Samuel, of calling him son and building his life around the child, the prospect of discovering family who might claim him would be deeply troubling. "Samuel is fortunate to have you," she said softly. "Whatever his origins." Preston's gaze shifted to her, his hazel eyes reflecting a vulnerability he rarely displayed. "Been thinking lately about making it official," he admitted. "Adoption papers, I mean, so there'd be no question about him being my son, legal-like." Hannah felt a surge of relief at his words, though she tried to maintain her professional demeanor. "That seems very sensible. It would secure his future." "That's my thinking," Preston agreed, watching as Samuel yawned widely in Hannah's arms. "He's ready for his afternoon nap, I reckon." Hannah nodded, reluctantly preparing to hand the drowsy baby back to Preston. As she did, their hands touched, and Preston's fingers lingered against hers for a moment longer than necessary. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through Hannah's arm, and she found herself meeting Preston's gaze with a startled awareness. Something shifted in that moment, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing between them, nurtured by their shared care of Samuel. It wasn't just the baby that drew Hannah to the McKinney ranch with such regularity. It was the man himself, with his quiet strength and unexpected tenderness. Preston cleared his throat and carefully adjusted Samuel against his shoulder. I appreciate you checking on him so faithfully, he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. Don't know how we'd have managed without your guidance these past months. It's been my pleasure, Hannah replied honestly. Samuel is a special child. She hesitated, then added, and you're a good father, Preston, better than many who have had years to prepare for the role. A faint color touched his cheekbones at her praise. Just doing my best by him. As Hannah prepared to leave, gathering her medical bag and checking that she'd left enough of the special formula for the coming days, Preston stood in the doorway with Samuel sleeping against his shoulder. Will you come to the Founders' Day picnic on Saturday? He asked suddenly. Town's putting on quite a celebration for the centennial from what I hear. Hannah paused, surprised by the invitation. I had planned to attend, yes. Doc Wilson insists on having a medical presence at such gatherings. Preston nodded, shifting Samuel slightly. Perhaps. Perhaps we might enjoy some of the festivities together. Samuel seems to like music, and they're bringing in a proper band from Helena. The careful way he phrased the invitation, the slight uncertainty in his expression, made Hannah realize this was more than a casual suggestion. Preston McKinney was asking to spend time with her beyond their established routine of Samuel's care. I would like that very much, she replied, her heart beating a little faster at the smile that spread across his face at her acceptance. Good, he said simply. That's good. As Hannah rode back to town, she found herself smiling despite the complications that loomed on the horizon. The sheriff's investigation might uncover Samuel's origins, and that could change everything. But for now, there was Saturday's picnic to anticipate, and the pleasure of watching Samuel grow, and the increasingly undeniable fact that her feelings for Preston McKinney had developed far beyond professional concern or even friendship. The Founders' Day celebration transformed the main street of Redemption Creek into a festive gathering. Bunting in red, white, and blue draped the buildings. Tables laden with food lined the street, and a platform had been erected at the end of town where a band from Helena was setting up their instruments. Hannah had taken special care with her appearance, wearing a blue calico dress she'd sewn herself, with her honey brown hair arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. She helped Doc Wilson set up a small medical tent, anticipating the usual minor injuries and ailments that accompanied such gatherings, all the while watching for Preston's arrival. She spotted him just after noon, making his way through the crowd with Samuel secured in the sling across his chest. He dressed in clean denims and a pressed shirt, his dark hair neatly combed beneath his good hat. Several people stopped him to greet Samuel, who had become something of a local celebrity in the small town. The sight of the serious cowboy showing off his adopted son with unmistakable pride warmed Hannah's heart. When Preston caught sight of her, his face brightened in a way that caused a flutter in her chest. He made his way directly to the medical tent, nodding politely to Doc Wilson before turning his attention to Hannah. Miss Edwards, he greeted her formally, mindful of the public setting. You look lovely today. Hannah felt a blush warm her cheeks at the simple compliment. Thank you, Mr. McKinney. And how is young Samuel enjoying his first community celebration? Preston adjusted the sling to reveal Samuel's face, his blue eyes wide as he took in the colorful decorations and busy crowd. Reckon he's finding it all mighty interesting. Hasn't fussed once since we arrived. Doc Wilson chuckled, adjusting his spectacles. Children are resilient creatures, and this one's had good care from what I can see. The older doctor had initially been skeptical of Preston's ability to raise Samuel properly, but Hannah's reports and his own observations had gradually convinced him of the cowboy's commitment. Miss Edwards deserves the credit for that, Preston said, his gaze warm as it rested on Hannah. Her guidance has been invaluable. Yes, well, Doc Wilson cleared his throat, looking between them with knowing eyes. Hannah has always had a way with little ones. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe Mrs. Patterson is waving me over to judge the pie contest. He winked at Hannah before ambling away, leaving them alone in the medical tent. He's not very subtle, Hannah murmured, embarrassed by her mentor's obvious matchmaking. Preston's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Can't say I mind his approval. He glanced around at the busy street. Are you required to stay here at the tent all afternoon? No, Doc Wilson and I are taking turns. I'm free until 4 o'clock, Hannah explained. In that case, Preston said, offering his arm, perhaps you'd accompany us to hear some of the music. And maybe try some of that famous pie before the judges claim it all. Hannah slipped her hand through his arm, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingers and the curious glances they were receiving from townspeople. I'd like that very much. They made their way through the celebration, stopping to speak with various residents of Redemption Creek. Hannah noticed how naturally Preston had integrated into the community in the months since Samuel's arrival. The solitary cowboy who had kept to himself was now engaged in conversations about cattle prices with the ranchers, discussing the summer rainfall with farmers, and accepting compliments on Samuel's growth from the women of the town. You've become quite the social butterfly, Hannah teased as they found a place to sit near the bandstand, balancing plates of Mrs. Patterson's apple pie. Preston looked genuinely surprised. Have I? When you first came to town, you barely spoke 2 words to anyone, Hannah reminded him. Now look at you on a first-name basis with half the county. Preston considered this as he adjusted Samuel to a more comfortable position. The baby was watching the musicians tuning their instruments with fascination. Reckon Samuel's changed more than just my sleeping habits, he admitted. Hard to stay isolated when you're responsible for someone else. He's brought you into the community, Hannah observed. Preston's gaze met hers, unusually earnest. He's brought me more than that. The simple statement held layers of meaning that made Hannah's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, Sheriff Collins approached their bench, his expression serious despite the festive atmosphere. McKinney, he nodded. Miss Edwards, enjoying the celebration. We are indeed, Sheriff, Hannah replied, noting the tension that had immediately appeared in Preston's shoulders at the lawman's arrival. Any news from Silver Creek? Preston asked directly, his voice carefully neutral. The sheriff glanced at Samuel, who was now attempting to grab at Preston's pie plate. As a matter of fact, yes, was hoping to speak with you privately, but anything concerning Samuel can be discussed in front of Miss Edwards, Preston interrupted firmly. She's been instrumental in his care. Sheriff Collins nodded, removing his hat. Very well. The woman in Silver Creek, a midwife named Constance Miller, claims she assisted in Samuel's birth in March. Says the mother was passing through, gave her name as Elizabeth Walsh. Young woman, unmarried, traveling west to meet family in Oregon. Hannah felt a chill despite the warm day. This was exactly what they had feared, concrete information about Samuel's origins. Did this midwife know why the mother abandoned her child? Preston asked, his voice tight. The sheriff shook his head. That's just it according to Mrs. Miller. The young woman was devoted to her baby, planned to continue her journey after recovering from the birth. But then Mrs. Miller heard that a stage was robbed about 10 miles west of Silver Creek in early April, 2 passengers killed. He looked gravely at Samuel. One was a young woman with a newborn. Hannah gasped softly. The poor woman. What happened to the baby after the robbery? Preston asked, his arm instinctively tightening around Samuel. That's where it gets interesting, Sheriff Collins continued. The driver reported that one of the male passengers, a fellow who survived the attack, took charge of the infant. Said he'd see it safely to the nearest town, but neither the man nor the baby ever showed up in the next settlement. Hannah and Preston exchanged a look of dawning understanding. You think someone brought Samuel all the way to Redemption Creek, then abandoned him at the church? Hannah asked. The sheriff nodded. It's my theory, yes. Perhaps this man intended to care for the orphan baby but found himself unable or unwilling. Rather than leave the child with strangers in the town where everyone would know the circumstances, he traveled further and left the baby where he was sure to be found and cared for. Preston was quiet, processing this information. Does the midwife or anyone in Silver Creek wish to claim Samuel? He finally asked, the question clearly difficult for him. No, Sheriff Collins said firmly. The mother has no known family in these parts, and Mrs. Miller was quite relieved to hear the baby had found a good home. He studied Preston for a moment. I understand you're planning to make the adoption official. That's right, Preston confirmed. Papers are being drawn up by Mr. Harrington. The sheriff nodded approvingly. Good, I'll add my report on the child's origins to the documentation. Should make the legal process smoother, having confirmation that the mother is deceased and no family has come forward. He replaced his hat. Consider the investigation closed, McKinney. That boy is yours in all but the final paperwork now. As the sheriff walked away, Hannah noticed Preston's shoulders sag slightly with relief. Are you all right? She asked gently. Preston looked down at Samuel, who had fallen asleep against his chest, oblivious to the revelations about his tragic beginnings. Just thinking about his poor mother, he said quietly. Traveling alone with a newborn only to meet such an end. Hannah placed her hand on his arm. At least we know she didn't abandon him willingly, and now Samuel has you. Preston covered her hand with his own, his palm warm and rough against her skin. And you, he added softly, don't know what we'd have done without you these past months, Hannah. The band began to play, a lively tune that had couples moving to the cleared area in front of the platform to dance. Preston and Hannah sat in companionable silence, watching the celebrations while Samuel slept peacefully. I've been thinking, Preston said after a while, his voice barely audible above the music. About the future. Hannah turned to look at him, struck by the seriousness in his expression. What about it? Preston seemed to struggle with his words, uncharacteristically hesitant. Samuel deserves a proper family, a complete one. Hannah's heart began to beat faster, unsure of his meaning but hoping. He has you, she said carefully. Yes, Preston agreed, meeting her eyes with newfound determination. But a boy needs a mother too, someone to teach him things I can't, someone to. He paused, drawing a deep breath, someone to make a home with. Hannah held very still, hardly daring to believe where this conversation might be heading. Preston, I know it's sudden, he continued, the words coming faster now. And I'm not a man of means or education, just a cowboy with a small ranch and a baby who came to me by chance. But these past months, having you in our lives, seeing how you are with Samuel, how you've helped us both. He stopped, seemed to gather his courage. Hannah Edwards, I find myself thinking of you as family already, and I was wondering if you might consider Preston McKinney, Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the moment like a knife. You simply must bring young Samuel over to meet my sister from Denver. She's never seen such a handsome baby. Preston closed his eyes briefly in frustration before turning to acknowledge the shopkeeper's wife. Be right there, Mrs. Patterson, he replied, managing a polite smile. When they were alone again, the moment had passed, the careful words left unfinished. Hannah felt simultaneously disappointed and relieved this was hardly the setting for such an important conversation. Preston stood, adjusting the still sleeping Samuel in his sling. We should probably make an appearance, he said apologetically. But Hannah, he reached for her hand, holding it firmly in his, might I call on you properly tomorrow? There's something important I'd like to discuss. The warmth in his eyes left little doubt about his intentions. Hannah felt a surge of joy mixed with nervous anticipation. Yes, she replied simply, I'd like that very much. As they made their way through the crowd, Hannah's mind raced with possibilities. Preston McKinney, the solitary cowboy who had unexpectedly become a father, now seemed to be considering another life-changing decision. And Hannah, who had come west seeking only independence and the chance to use her medical skills, found herself contemplating a future far different from anything she had imagined. The next day dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching fall. Hannah moved through her morning duties at the doctor's office with distracted efficiency, her mind constantly returning to Preston's unfinished words from the day before and his promise to call on her properly. When a knock came at the office door shortly after noon, Hannah's heart leapt, but it was only Jimmy Fredericks, the young man who helped at Preston's ranch. Morning, Miss Edwards, Jimmy said, removing his hat. Mr. McKinney sent me with a message. Says he's awful sorry, but Samuel's running a fever and he can't leave him. Asks if you might be able to come out to the ranch instead if it ain't too much trouble. Concern immediately replaced Hannah's disappointment. Of course, let me gather my medical bag. Doc Wilson, who had overheard from the examination room, waved her off. Go on, Hannah, we've nothing pressing here today. The ride to the McKinney ranch seemed longer than usual as Hannah worried about Samuel's condition. A fever in an infant could be serious, potentially indicating any number of ailments from a simple cold to something far more dangerous. When she arrived, Preston met her at the door, Samuel fussing weakly in his arms. The baby's normally rosy cheeks were flushed, his forehead hot to Hannah's touch. "When did this start?" she asked, immediately shifting into her professional role. "Noticed he was warm this morning," Preston explained, following her into the house. "Thought at first it was just the warm night, but he's been fussy and refusing his bottle. Fever seemed to get worse about an hour ago." Hannah examined Samuel thoroughly, checking his throat, ears, and chest while Preston hovered anxiously nearby. The baby whimpered at her touch, clearly uncomfortable. "His throat appears slightly inflamed," Hannah reported. "And there's some congestion in his chest. It seems to be a mild infection, not uncommon in infants." Relief washed over Preston's face. "So it's not serious, we'll need to watch him closely," Hannah cautioned, "but with proper care he should recover well. We'll need to keep him cool and ensure he takes enough fluids." For the next several hours, Hannah and Preston worked together to bring Samuel's fever down, using cool cloths and a willow bark tea greatly diluted for an infant. By late afternoon, the baby's temperature had decreased slightly, and he had finally accepted some milk, though less than his usual amount. "You should rest," Hannah told Preston, noticing the exhaustion evident in his face. "You've been up with him since dawn." Preston shook his head. "I'm fine." "You won't be any good to Samuel if you fall ill yourself," Hannah insisted. "Lie down for an hour, I'll watch over him." After some persuasion, Preston reluctantly stretched out on the sofa in the main room while Hannah sat in the rocking chair with Samuel dozing fitfully against her shoulder. She hummed softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung, watching as Preston's eyes grew heavy despite his determination to stay awake. When he finally surrendered to sleep, Hannah studied his face, relaxed now in a way it rarely was when he was conscious. The perpetual furrow between his brows had smoothed out, making him appear younger. There was a vulnerability to him in sleep that tugged at her heart, this strong, capable man who had taken on the enormous responsibility of a child without hesitation, who worked tirelessly to provide and care for Samuel, who had somehow made room in his solitary life for both a baby and, increasingly, for her. Samuel stirred against her shoulder, whimpering softly. Hannah rose carefully and paced the room, patting his back and continuing her quiet humming. The domestic intimacy of the moment struck her forcefully caring for a feverish child while his father slept nearby. The three of them cocooned in the warm safety of the cabin as afternoon faded toward evening. This was what Preston had begun to speak of at the Founders' Day celebration, she realized. Not just a proposal of convenience for Samuel's sake, but the creation of a true family built on the foundation of the bond that had grown between them over these months of shared care and concern. Preston woke with a start as Samuel began to cry more insistently. He sat up quickly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "How long was I asleep?" he asked, voice rough. "About 2 hours," Hannah replied, bringing Samuel to him. "His fever's still present but not worsening." Preston took the baby, pressing his lips to Samuel's forehead to gauge his temperature. "Still too warm," he murmured worriedly. "It may take a day or two for the fever to break completely," Hannah explained, sitting beside him on the sofa. "But he's taking fluids, which is a good sign." They sat together in the dimming light, Samuel between them, their shoulders touching lightly. The conversation Preston had planned seemed far from both their minds now, superseded by concern for the child who had brought them together. "I never thought I'd be so frightened by a simple fever," Preston admitted quietly. "When I woke up and felt how hot he was this morning, my heart nearly stopped." "That's parenthood," Hannah said softly, constant worry mixed with incredible joy. Preston looked at her, his hazel eyes serious in the fading light. "Is that something you've wanted for yourself? Children, I mean?" Hannah considered the question, aware of its deeper implications. "Yes," she answered honestly, though I had begun to think it might not be part of my future. Coming west as I did at my age without family connections. She trailed off, then added more firmly, "But yes, I've always hoped to be a mother someday." Something shifted in Preston's expression, a softening, a certainty. "Hannah," he began, but Samuel chose that moment to start crying again, his fever clearly causing him discomfort. The moment passed as they returned to the practical concerns of caring for the sick infant. By the time Samuel had been soothed, fed, and finally settled into a more peaceful sleep, night had fallen completely. Hannah realized she had stayed far longer than intended, and propriety demanded she return to town. "It's too dark for you to ride back alone," Preston protested when she mentioned leaving. "The trail can be treacherous even in daylight." "I can't stay here overnight," Hannah replied, though the thought of leaving Samuel while he was ill distressed her. "It wouldn't be proper." Preston ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "Proper or not, I can't let you risk that ride in the dark. If you're worried about your reputation, I'll sleep in the barn." The absurdity of the offer that he would vacate his own home to preserve her good name almost made Hannah smile despite her concern. "That's hardly necessary. I could sit up with Samuel in the rocking chair. It wouldn't be the first time I've watched through the night with a patient." Preston's expression was torn between relief that she would stay to help with Samuel and discomfort at the unconventional arrangement. "At least take my bed," he insisted. "I'll stay out here with Samuel." In the end, Hannah agreed to rest in Preston's room while he kept watch over the baby, with the understanding that they would trade places if Samuel's condition worsened or if Preston needed sleep. The intimacy of using his personal space was not lost on her as she entered the small bedroom, noting the neat simplicity of it: a bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, a small table with a lamp, and a book of poetry that surprised her. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events and the realization of how completely her life had become intertwined with Preston and Samuel's. What had begun as professional concern for an abandoned infant had evolved into something far deeper: genuine love for the child and increasingly undeniable feelings for the man who had claimed him as his own. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. After an hour of restless turning, Hannah rose and quietly returned to the main room. Preston sat in the rocking chair near the fireplace, Samuel sleeping against his chest. He looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. "I couldn't sleep," she explained softly, moving to stand beside the chair. "How is he?" "Cooler, I think," Preston whispered, careful not to disturb the baby. "His breathing seems easier." Hannah gently placed her palm on Samuel's forehead, relieved to find it noticeably less hot than before. "The fever's breaking," she confirmed. "He should be much improved by morning." Preston's relief was palpable. "Thank you for coming today, for staying." "Of course," Hannah replied simply. "I care about Samuel too." Their eyes met in the dim light of the dying fire, and the unspoken words from earlier seemed to hover between them once more. Preston shifted Samuel carefully to one arm and reached for Hannah's hand with the other. "What I tried to say earlier," he began, his voice low but steady. "What I've been wanting to say since yesterday," he paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Hannah, these past months with you in our lives have been the happiest I can remember. Not just because of your help with Samuel, though I'll be forever grateful for that, but because of who you are: your kindness, your strength, your gentle heart." Hannah's pulse quickened as Preston continued, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I know this isn't the romantic setting I'd planned," he said with a small, self-deprecating smile, "and I'm not a man of fancy words, but I've come to love you, Hannah Edwards. And if you could see your way clear to considering a life with me and Samuel, I'd count myself the luckiest man in the territory." The simple, heartfelt declaration brought tears to Hannah's eyes. She knelt beside the rocking chair, bringing herself level with Preston and the sleeping baby between them. "I love both of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "More than I thought possible. And yes, Preston McKinney, I would be honored to build a life with you and Samuel." The joy that spread across Preston's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He leaned forward carefully, mindful of Samuel, and pressed his lips to Hannah's in a gentle, tender kiss that held the promise of their future together. When they parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "Not exactly how I planned to ask," he admitted ruefully. "Had it all worked out in my head proper, calling at your home, flowers from Mrs. Patterson's garden, asking properly on one knee." Hannah smiled, brushing her fingers along his jaw. "This is better," she assured him. "The three of us together, it feels right." Samuel stirred between them, making the small, contented sound they had come to recognize as his way of settling deeper into sleep. They both looked down at him, this tiny being who had brought them together through the most unexpected of circumstances. "He'll need a mother's name on those adoption papers," Preston said softly. "If you're willing." "I am," Hannah replied without hesitation, "more than willing." They remained that way for a long moment, Preston in the rocking chair with Samuel sleeping against his chest, Hannah kneeling beside them. Their hands clasped, a family formed not by blood but by love and choice, and the mysterious workings of providence that had led an abandoned baby to the church steps, where a lonely cowboy would find him. By morning, Samuel's fever had broken completely. Hannah returned to town to explain her absence to Doc Wilson and to begin making arrangements for the changes to come. The doctor, far from being surprised, merely chuckled and confessed he'd been wondering how long it would take Preston to come to his senses and propose. "Been watching you two dance around each other for months," he said with a wink. "That baby was the best matchmaker this town's seen in years." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Redemption Creek, met with general approval and more than a few comments that it had been obvious to everyone but them how things would turn out. Hannah found herself suddenly the center of attention, receiving congratulations and advice from the married women of the town, while Preston was subjected to good-natured teasing from the men when he came to town for supplies. They were married 2 weeks later in the same church where Samuel had been found, with the baby contentedly watching the proceedings from Mrs. Simmons' arms. Reverend Thomas spoke eloquently about families formed by love rather than blood, and about the mysterious ways in which God brought people together. Preston, uncharacteristically formal in a new suit, stumbled slightly over his vows but spoke them with such earnest sincerity that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. Hannah, in a simple ivory dress she had worked on late into the nights leading up to the wedding, felt a profound sense of rightness as she promised to love and cherish both Preston and Samuel for all the days of her life. After the ceremony, the entire town celebrated with a feast that rivaled the Founders' Day picnic. Samuel was passed from admiring arms to admiring arms, his earlier illness completely forgotten as he charmed everyone with his newly discovered ability to laugh aloud. When they finally returned to the ranch home now to all three of them, Preston carried Hannah across the threshold in the traditional manner, with Samuel secured in the sling across his chest, creating a somewhat comical picture that had them both laughing. "Not exactly the traditional wedding night," Preston apologized as Samuel began to fuss for his evening feeding. Hannah smiled, taking the baby from him. "We're not exactly a traditional family," she reminded him, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." As autumn turned to winter, the McKinney ranch settled into new rhythms. Hannah continued her work with Doc Wilson, though on a reduced schedule that allowed her to be home with Samuel while Preston tended to the ranch. The cabin expanded with the addition of a proper nursery for Samuel and improvements to make it more suitable for a family of 3. The adoption became official in November, with Samuel legally recognized as the son of Preston and Hannah McKinney. The document recording his parentage made no mention of his unusual beginnings, stating simply that he had been welcomed into their family with love. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside the windows of their warm cabin, Preston and Hannah sat before the fire with Samuel between them on a quilt. At 9 months old, he was sitting up confidently and beginning to crawl, exploring his world with boundless curiosity and energy. "Hard to believe it's been less than a year since I found him on those church steps," Preston remarked, watching as Samuel determinedly reached for a wooden toy horse. "Feels like he's always been ours." Hannah leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she first came west. "In all the ways that matter, he has been," she said softly. "Some families are formed in an instant, not grown over time." Preston turned to press a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made, picking up that crying baby," he murmured. "Brought me not just a son, but you as well." Hannah smiled, a secret joy warming her from within. "Perhaps next Christmas, Samuel will have a brother or sister to share his toys with," she said, watching Preston's expression carefully. It took a moment for her meaning to register, but when it did, Preston's face transformed with wonder. "Hannah, are you saying?" She nodded, her eyes bright with happy tears. "Doc Wilson confirmed it yesterday. We're expecting a baby in early summer." Preston's whoop of joy startled Samuel, who looked up in surprise before breaking into delighted giggles as his father scooped him up and spun him around. "Did you hear that, Samuel? You're going to be a big brother." As Preston pulled her into their embrace, Samuel patting her face with his small hands, Hannah marveled at the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. An abandoned baby, a solitary cowboy, a woman seeking purpose in a new place, three separate paths that had converged to create a family bound by love and choice rather than blood. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Montana landscape in pristine white. Inside the McKinney cabin, the future stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility, all because a baby had cried on the steps of a church, and a cowboy had stopped to listen.